The sky had never looked so endless. At 40,000 feet, the horizon stretched like a pale ribbon, and the world below seemed impossibly small. Tiny towns, winding rivers, and clouds that glimmered like cotton under the afternoon sun. On Flight 872, most passengers were lost in movies, headphones, or the gentle hum of the cabin, completely unaware that this routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary. The crew moved through the aisles with practiced calm, unaware that minutes from now, the very thing they were trained to fear would happen. It began as a quiet anomaly, a subtle vibration in the engines, so faint that the passengers barely noticed. But in the cockpit, Captain Lewis's brow furrowed. His co-pilot, Sarah, glanced at the gauges, then at him, eyes widening as the indicators began to flicker. Both engines had begun to Panic is rarely immediate in the cabin of a plane, but in the cockpit, fear can be clinical, measured, and terrifying all at once. The hum of the engines faded, replaced by an eerie silence that made the metal walls of the aircraft feel heavier, closer, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. For a moment, there was disbelief. Both engines, Lewis muttered, gripping the yoke. Sarah nodded, her hands moving automatically to check backup systems, yet her voice trembled despite years of experience. We're losing thrust fast. Altitude dropping. We need a TC now. The radio crackled, but the world outside remained the same, peaceful, oblivious, indifferent. Down below, air traffic control technicians noticed the unusual signals almost immediately. Their screens lit up with the alarming indicators. Flight 872, altitude falling rapidly, engines offline. The room, normally a place of calm routine, erupted into coordinated urgency. Controllers spoke into their microphones with measured authority, yet each word carried the weight of possible disaster. In situations like these, every second matters, and every choice can mean life or death. Passengers began to notice. Murmurs rippled through the cabin as the plane shook lightly, a reminder that the hum of normal flight had vanished. Parents clutched children, couples held hands tightly, and strangers looked to one another with shared unspoken fear. The overhead screens flickered as flight attendants tried to calm everyone, speaking through practiced smiles that masked their own anxiety. Some passengers reached for their phones, hoping for connection or guidance, though in truth, there was little they could do except wait. But amid the tension, something unusual happened, something that would change the course of this near. Somewhere in the back of the plane, a voice, young, calm, and strangely confident, cut through the static of fear. It was a boy, 12 years old, seated in the third row from the emergency exit. He had been traveling with his older sister, quietly playing a flight simulator game on his tablet, completely absorbed in the mechanics of virtual flight. And now, the same instincts honed in digital skies were about to collide with the stark reality of the one outside the window. Call sign Raptor, he said, almost to himself at first, then louder, as though issuing a command. The words seemed small, insignificant against the roar of a failing plane, but air traffic control picked up the transmission. Their initial reaction was confusion. A child speaking over the radio? Surely it was interference. But then the voice repeated, precise and deliberate. Flight 872, call sign Raptor, request vector. In that moment, everyone in the control room paused. Something about the voice, its clarity and calm, carried authority no one expected from a The controllers exchanged glances, unsure whether this was a prank or an impossibility. Yet the boy continued, providing readings and observations that mirrored the flight instruments they were monitoring. He was not guessing. He was calculating. Captain Lewis and Sarah were astonished. Did we just hear a kid? Sarah muttered, disbelief in her voice. Lewis shook his head, but his training forced him to stay calm. We've got to verify the signal. If it's accurate, it could help. He didn't finish the thought. None of them wanted to imagine the alternative. The boy's calm voice guided the crew through maneuvers that only experienced pilots usually attempt under such duress. He called out headings, altitude adjustments, even engine troubleshooting steps in a rhythm that seemed impossibly precise. Passengers, sensing something extraordinary unfolding, pressed their faces to the windows, craning their necks, as if the clouds themselves might hold answers. The cabin had become a mix of fear and wonder, every person silently aware that they were witnessing something rare, an act of courage and intelligence far beyond what anyone expected. Out outside the cockpit, the plane continued its descent, engine steady, gliding like a giant metallic bird with wings spread wide against the expanse of sky. The ground below approached faster than anyone hoped. The boy's guidance over the radio became the thread keeping chaos at bay. Each instruction, a lifeline. Each adjustment, a small victory against gravity's relentless pull. In the control room, the lead controller leaned forward, gripping the edge of his console. I don't know how, but this kid is keeping the flight alive, he whispered to a colleague. His words were almost inaudible over the comms, but the gravity of the situation was clear. Every second they could stabilize the plane gave those on board a chance, just a chance to survive. Meanwhile, stories were already beginning to form in passengers' minds. Parents whispered to children about bravery and miracles. Some quietly recorded videos, their fingers shaking, capturing the boy's voice as it issued calm commands to a plane careening toward an uncertain fate. Every instruction from Raptor brought hope, but the tension never left. The altitude kept falling, and the engines remained lifeless. It was a delicate dance of trust, skill, and intuition, one that no simulator could truly prepare anyone for. In the back of the cabin, the boy remained focused. Sweat dotted his forehead, his hands hovering over the tablet as if it were a cockpit of its own. He had never imagined this would happen, not in a dream, not in his games. Yet here he was, commanding attention and respect in the most extreme circumstances any 12-year-old could face. He was calm, yet inside, his mind raced. Calculations, trajectory, wind speed, glide paths, every factor mattered. One small misstep, one missed reading, and the story of Flight 872 could have ended in tragedy. And then, just as the tension reached a near unbearable peak, the radio squawked again. This time the voice wasn't alone. Captain Lewis, now fully engaged, confirmed the boy's readings with the instruments. Raptor, we copy your vector. Adjust heading 27. Maintain glide speed. You're right on track. The words were surreal. A child's guidance was being followed to save hundreds of lives. The line between impossible and reality blurred, and everyone involved understood that what was happening was more than mere chance. It was extraordinary. Every passenger, crew member, and controller became acutely aware of a truth that day. Heroes come in all forms, and sometimes courage is found where it's least expected. The boy's voice, calm, precise, unwavering, was not just giving directions. It was giving hope, and yet, the danger was far from over. 40,000 feet is not a forgiving altitude, and without engines, the margin for error is razor. Every decision, every adjustment, had consequences that could ripple instantly through the plane and the lives it carried. As Flight 872 continued its descent, the world outside seemed indifferent, clouds drifting lazily, unaware of the drama unfolding within. But inside the cabin, inside the control room, and even in the minds of the passengers, a quiet truth settled. They were witnesses to something rare, something that would be remembered long after the wheels touched or failed to touch the ground. The story of Flight 872, of the boy known only by his call sign Raptor, was only beginning to unfold. No one could predict what would happen next. Would the plane make it safely to the nearest airfield? Could the instructions of a 12-year-old truly prevent disaster at this height? Every heart in the cabin beat in rhythm with the ticking clock, every hand gripping a seat or a console holding on to hope. And above it all, the calm voice of a child continued to guide them through the impossible. Minutes stretched like hours. The tension, the fear, the all of it, combined into a singular moment suspended in time. And as the ground rushed closer, as reality pressed in with gravity and wind and uncertainty, one thought lingered in every mind aboard Flight 872. In the sky, at 40,000 feet, with both engines dead, salvation had come from the most unexpected place. A 12-year-old who answered simply, confidently, and bravely, call sign Raptor. As Flight 872 glided through the thinning air, the passengers began to settle into a tense silence, each person lost in their thoughts. Some stared at the overhead compartments, imagining the clouds as barriers they could somehow see through. Others closed their eyes, holding on to loved ones or clasping their own hands so tightly that their knuckles whitened. The boy known only as Raptor remained in his seat, tablet in hand, eyes scanning data faster than most adults could comprehend. He wasn't just playing a game anymore, he was living it. And with every passing second, the reality pressed heavier. This was real, and failure was not an option. Outside the cabin, the engines remained lifeless, their silence unnerving. The usual hum that reassured travelers that a plane was under control was gone, replaced by the soft whistle of wind against the fuselage and the occasional creak of stressed metal. Captain Lewis's hands never left the yoke. His experience told him to remain calm, to rely on protocols, but even the most seasoned pilots know that some situations can defy every manual. Sarah monitored instruments furiously, eyes darting between altitudes, wind vectors, and the barely functioning autopilot. They had lost power, lost routine, lost the normalcy that makes flying feel safe. Meanwhile, air traffic control worked like a well-oiled machine, but each controller felt the weight of lives hanging in the balance. Every decision, every instruction carried immediate consequences. The lead controller, Maria, was seasoned, having guided planes through emergencies before, but something about this situation gnawed at her differently. The voice of a child over the radio, clear, confident, and unnervingly precise, challenged every assumption she had about control, authority, and capability. Her fingers hovered over the communication console, typing instructions to the crew, all the while feeling that unseen connection between the boy and the plane. Inside the cabin, passengers tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. Mothers whispered reassurances to children who were suddenly wafted, some leaning forward to listen for the boy's calm instructions over the radio. A few older passengers muttered in disbelief, arguing quietly with themselves about whether this was real or some malfunction. Flight attendants, trained to maintain composure, moved quickly through the aisles, offering smiles and gestures of reassurance. But even they couldn't hide the subtle tremor in their movements. Fear had a way of seeping into every corner of the cabin, and the presence of the boy, calm and collected, became the only anchor keeping panic at bay. Raptor's story didn't begin on this flight. He had always been fascinated with flight, not as a passing curiosity, but as a deep, consuming passion. His room was filled with model planes, flight charts, and computer screens displaying simulators that he could operate with uncanny skill. At school, teachers often marveled at his ability to read complex technical manuals and translate them into practical actions. Friends, when they could keep up, watched him navigate simulations as if he was born in the cockpit rather than a classroom, and though his parents encouraged him, they never imagined that one day, their 12-year-old son's skills would become a lifeline for hundreds of strangers. High above the earth. On this particular day, the family had boarded Flight 872 for a simple trip of vacation that was supposed to be fun, ordinary, and uneventful. But as soon as the plane left the ground, Raptor's mind couldn't stop running simulations, imagining different flight paths, wind currents, and altitude adjustments. He had learned all the emergency procedures in theory, and had even practiced them in his simulator at home. But nothing could fully prepare him for the reality of an airplane losing both engines at cruising altitude. The boy's sister, 12-year-old Emma, noticed her brother's unusual calm. She had always known him to be different, methodical, precise, and quietly confident, but this was something else entirely. She glanced at him as he spoke into the tablet, issuing instructions over the radio. "Are you sure you can do this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Raptor didn't answer. He didn't need to. Every movement, every calculation, was evidence enough. She realized, with a mixture of awe and fear, that she was witnessing her brother act in a way most adults could not. Back in the cockpit, Captain Lewis struggled to process the surreal situation. He was trained to trust experience, instruments, and procedure, but now a child's guidance was proving not only accurate but life-saving. "We're following his headings," Sarah said, glancing at him. "It's working." Lewis nodded, though he felt the pull of disbelief. The instruments confirmed the boy's calculations. He adjusted the glide path, corrected for wind shear, and offered real-time advice, all while communicating with air traffic control. It was an orchestra of precision, and the conductor was 12 years old. Air traffic control couldn't help but probe further. Raptor Maria asked carefully, "What training do you have? How do you know these adjustments?" There was a pause before the boy responded, calm and composed. "Flight simulators, online courses, practice. I've studied gliding patterns and emergency procedures. I know what's happening now, and what needs to be done." The simplicity and confidence of the answer sent a ripple through the control room. It was not arrogance, it was knowledge. Distilled and applied under unimaginable pressure, passengers began to piece together the extraordinary reality of their situation. Conversations that had started in fear slowly shifted to curiosity and awe. They watched the child become a figure of authority, a source of hope. A businessman, usually impatient and dismissive of anything outside his routine, whispered to his neighbor, "That boy, he's saving us." An elderly woman clutched her prayer beads, tears in her eyes, and nodded silently, feeling a strange sense of relief amid the terror. Yet danger remained. Even with the boy's guidance, Flight 872 was still a plane without engines, gliding toward unknown terrain at 40,000 feet. Every adjustment was a delicate calculation. One misstep, one wrong vector, could send the aircraft into a spiral from which recovery would be impossible. The sense of urgency never left the cabin, never left the cockpit, never left the control room. It was a constant hum of tension, a reminder that even hero's child or adult operate within the fragile constraints of physics and chance. As the plane descended, Raptor's thoughts drifted briefly to his own life. He thought of the hours he had spent alone in his room, learning, experimenting, failing, and trying again. He remembered late nights with his parents encouraging him, teachers marveling at his abilities, friends frustrated that he often took things so seriously. And now, all of that preparation, all of those small, quiet moments, had led to this extraordinary point. He was responsible for hundreds of lives, a burden that could crush anyone. But instead of panic, he felt focus, clarity, and purpose. Captain Lewis, too, wrestled with his own background. He had flown for decades, faced emergencies that would shake most people, and yet nothing had prepared him for this. A child, a 12-year-old, was guiding his actions. The thought should have been impossible, even dangerous. But as he followed the boy's instructions, he saw the numbers line up, the glide path hold steady, and a small, fragile hope begin to blossom. He realized that experience alone doesn't define authority in moments like these. Skill, intuition, and courage do. Back in the cabin, fear remained, but awe began to creep in. Passengers whispered to one another, piecing together fragments of what was happening. Some recorded video discreetly, not just for memory, but as proof of the unbelievable. A teenager in the row ahead of Raptor's sister whispered, "That kid is like a real-life pilot." And in a way, he was also just a boy, 12 years old, thrust into a situation that could destroy him emotionally, as well as physically if it ended badly. The weight of responsibility was immense, yet he carried it with a calm that belied his age. Outside, the world continued, indifferent. The clouds drifted lazily, the sun shimmered on distant lakes, and the earth kept turning, unaware that high above a metal bird fought to stay in the air with no engines. Guided by the mind of a child, gravity pressed relentlessly, reminding everyone involved that survival was not guaranteed. The thrill, the suspense, the fear, it all blended into a tension so palpable that even those not trained to read it could feel it, an invisible pulse that ran through every hand gripping a seat, every eye scanning a screen, every mind calculating the impossible. The boy's sister, Emma, watched him closely. She understood more than anyone that this wasn't just luck. Her brother had studied, trained, and imagined these moments endlessly. Yet no simulation could truly prepare someone for life and death hanging in the balance at 40,000 feet. Still, she trusted him, her awe tempered with worry. She whispered, almost to herself, "Come on, Raptor, don't let anything happen." He didn't respond, not because he ignored her, but because he didn't need words. Every command he gave, every adjustment he calculated, was a response, a shield, and a lifeline all at once. Meanwhile, air traffic control worked frantically, trying to coordinate a safe landing. They searched for the nearest airports with long enough runways, clear weather, and emergency services ready. Controllers made rapid calculations, plotted trajectories, and attempted to balance every factor against the fragile glide path of the powerless plane. Maria felt her heart tighten with each passing minute. In her years of experience, she had guided pilots through engine failures, weather disasters, and emergencies, but never had a child's voice been the key to survival. And still, even with the guidance, the plane's descent was anything but smooth. Turbulence shook the fuselage intermittently, reminders that nature cannot be fully tamed. Passengers gripped armrests, whispered prayers, and silently prepared for whatever might come. Yet amid the fear, a quiet thread of hope wove through the cabin. The boy's voice, steady and unwavering, gave them something to hold on to. It reminded them that sometimes courage comes from the most unexpected places, and skill does not always come with age. Even as the plane continued to descend, every person on board felt the weight of the unknown. There was no certainty of what would happen next. Even with Raptor guiding them, the engines were dead, the runway miles away, and the margin for error thinner than any human hair. The suspense was unbearable, a constant reminder that at 40,000 feet, survival is never guaranteed. Every second counted, every decision mattered, and every breath carried the tension of what could go right or horribly wrong. Yet the story of Flight 872 was about more than survival. It was about preparation, skill, courage, and the extraordinary abilities hidden within ordinary people. It was about a boy who had devoted countless hours to something he loved, suddenly finding himself at the center of a crisis that tested not just knowledge, but composure, intuition, and moral courage. And it was about everyone else on board, whose lives were intertwined with his, now dependent on a mind they never expected could hold the power to save them. As the plane continued its precarious journey, a thought echoed quietly in every mind on board. The world could be terrifying, but it could also be miraculous, and sometimes the line between the two is thinner than anyone realizes. Flight 872 was a testament to that fragile balance, a reminder that heroism doesn't always come from authority or experience. It can come from skill, courage, and determination, even in the smallest, most unlikely package. And so, the plane kept gliding, descending slowly but surely, engines silent, lives hanging in the balance, and a 12-year-old boy over the radio, calling himself Raptor, guiding them through the impossible. Every heart on board held its breath, every eye stayed fixed on the horizon, and every mind wondered the same thing. Could the extraordinary calm and skill of a child really be enough to see them through what lay ahead? The descent of Flight 872 seemed endless. Outside the windows, the clouds thickened, gray and heavy, blotting out the sun and turning the sky into a muted, oppressive dome. The plane, still without engines, cut through the air with the eerie grace of a glider, every movement deliberate yet fraught with risk. Captain Lewis adjusted the yoke, following the boy's instructions to the letter, his mind racing with the calculations, vectors, and contingencies that no one had ever thought he would need to consider. He had guided flights through storms, dealt with mechanical failures, even emergency landings, but never had he trusted the life of his plane, his crew, and hundreds of passengers to the commands of a child. Inside the cabin, the tension had shifted from fear to a complex mixture of anxiety, awe, and restless anticipation. Parents tried to comfort children, but their own voices quivered as the hum of engines, the one reassurance they had always taken for granted, remained absent. A woman sitting near the emergency exit clutched her phone, capturing moments she could never forget, whispering to her partner, He's really doing it." The boy passenger processed the unfolding crisis in their own way, some silent and stoic, others nervous and trembling, and a few audibly praying for survival. Every pair of eyes eventually gravitated to the boy seated in the middle of the plane, whose fingers danced over a tablet with methodical precision. Raptor's calm was almost unsettling in its intensity. He had trained for years, yes, but never under this kind of real, unrelenting pressure. His thoughts moved quickly between wind speed, glide angle, and proximity to the nearest airfield. Every adjustment he suggested to Captain Lewis was backed by data, mental calculations, an experience that had only existed in simulation until now. And yet, despite the chaos, he felt an odd clarity, his mind sharpened in the crucible of immediate danger. His sister Emma watched closely, torn between admiration and terror. She remembered the countless hours her brother had spent perfecting his simulator flights, the late nights hunched over charts, the endless questions about aerodynamics and engine performance, and now, all that preparation was translating into real-life instructions keeping them aloft. She leaned over to another passenger near her, whispering, "I can't believe he's really doing this." "He's just a kid," the man nodded, a lump forming in his throat as he realized how extraordinary this child truly was. Meanwhile, air traffic control was frantically coordinating with multiple agencies. Fire crews, emergency medical teams, and airport personnel were put on high alert. Controllers tried to clear airspace, redirect other flights, and map the plane's likely trajectory. But the unpredictability of a powerless aircraft at 40,000 feet made everything difficult. Maria, the lead controller, felt her pulse racing as she watched the plane's vector data update. Each decision she made could mean the difference between life and death. Her eyes flicked between the screens showing the plane's position and the live feed from the cockpit, where she could hear the boys' calm instructions cutting through the static. Outside, a storm front approached a wrinkle in an already impossible situation. Lightning flashed in the distance, painting the clouds in fleeting strokes of white, and turbulence began to shake the fuselage with growing intensity. The plane groaned under the strain, and passengers felt it acutely, clutching armrests or holding onto each other for reassurance. The emergency lights blinked in rhythm with the chaos, and the soft, mechanical creaks of the aircraft became a soundtrack of suspense that no one could ignore. Captain Lewis adjusted again, carefully banking to compensate for the wind shear. "Raptor, you're going to have to account for turbulence," he said, his voice calm but edged with tension. The boy's response was immediate, precise, and almost mechanical. "Increase glide speed by 10 knots, heading to compensate for gust factor 3. Lewis followed the instructions, watching the instruments and nodding as the plane responded exactly as predicted. Amid this main conflict, smaller stories unfolded. A young flight attendant named Jessica moved methodically through the cabin, offering water and reassurance, quietly managing passengers who were beginning to panic. She had been in the airline industry for over a decade, but never had she been part of something this extreme. Her own fear bubbled beneath the surface, yet she pushed it down, focusing entirely on the passengers, on giving them a sense of calm she wasn't sure she herself felt. Nearby, an elderly man in business attire gripped the seat in front of him. His wife whispered calming words into his ear, but his mind was racing. He had flown countless times, always confident in the mechanics and reliability of airplanes, but now he realized how fragile human life could be, how dependent everyone was on someone or something outside their control. He glanced at the boy and felt a pang of gratitude mixed with disbelief. This child, sitting quietly in the middle of the cabin, had become the linchpin holding everyone's lives together. Back in the cockpit, the tension between experience and trust played out subtly. Lewis had spent decades training for emergencies like this, yet every instruction from the boy challenged his instincts, his knowledge, his ego. He couldn't afford to dismiss it. Every command from Raptor aligned perfectly with the instruments, with physics, and with the turbulent conditions they were facing. Trust became a necessity, not a choice. Sarah glanced at Lewis and murmured, "I don't know how, but we're going to follow him." Meanwhile, the boy's inner thoughts revealed another layer of the story. He was aware of the weight on his shoulders, the hundreds of lives depending on his calculations. And yet, he also thought of his own life, his sister, his parents waiting at the destination, unaware of the crisis above them. He realized that the difference between success and catastrophe could hinge on his next calculation, his next instruction. A minor error, a misread wind vector, or a slight miscalculation could end everything. But he refused to panic. Fear had to be managed, rationalized, and applied, and in that, he excelled beyond anyone's expectation. Back at air traffic control, Maria wrestled with another dilemma. Should she try to get the boy to land the plane alone via guidance, or should she push Captain Lewis to take more direct control? She knew that even slight miscommunications could be catastrophic. She chose to trust the boy, but every passing second brought a new wave of variables: shift in weather, potential air traffic conflicts, and the physical limitations of the aircraft. Her mind raced as she tried to anticipate every possible outcome, while simultaneously coordinating multiple emergency teams. Tension in the cabin remained high. Some passengers had started murmuring to one another, sharing bits of conversation to process the stress collectively. A father held his teenage son, whispering, "Look at him. That boy is saving us. Can you believe it?" The teenager nodded, awestruck, and for a moment, the fear gave way to admiration. Yet, the underlying reality remained. They were still hurtling through the air at 40,000 feet, without engines, dependent on a child they barely knew, and a fragile chain of calculations. Meanwhile, subtle interpersonal dynamics began to emerge. Some passengers began blaming others for the situation in hushed tones, though rationally they knew no one was at fault. The stress revealed hidden tensions, old rivalries, and personal fears. Yet, against all odds, Raptors.com presence acted as a stabilizing force, a focal point of attention that reminded everyone that survival depended on cooperation, trust, and focus rather than panic. As the plane approached lower altitudes, the challenge escalated. The terrain below was dotted with mountains, forests, and urban areas. Any landing attempt would require precision, awareness, and flawless calculation. Captain Lewis and Sarah followed. Every command from Raptor, their voices clipped, professional, precise. Passengers clutched seats, held hands, and prayed silently. Air traffic control coordinated emergency vehicles along multiple potential landing sites, each contingency adding layers of complexity to an already impossible task. The boy, however, remained undeterred. He shifted seamlessly between instrument data, the plane's current trajectory, and projected wind vectors. His calculations included margins for error, adjustments for turbulence, and strategies for controlling descent speed. And yet, he knew there were limits. No amount of calculation could guarantee perfect execution. Every move required collaboration and split-second timing. One misstep from any participant could cascade into disaster. The storm continued to build. Lightning flashed closer, illuminating the anxious faces of passengers and the straining fuselage. Turbulence worsened. The plane shuddered, and overhead bins rattled, reminding everyone that even small forces could compound in unpredictable ways. The boy called out adjustments, and Captain Lewis responded instantly, adjusting the glide and making minor corrections. Air traffic control relayed updates, offering vectors, suggesting emergency measures, and constantly calculating potential outcomes. Throughout all this, human stories continued to unfold. Parents whispered reassurances, children clung tightly to those beside them, flight attendants moved methodically, navigating fear and duty simultaneously. Each person became a part of the delicate ecosystem keeping Flight 872 aloft. The boy, Emma, Captain Lewis, Sarah, passengers, and air traffic control all operated as interdependent elements of a high-stakes drama, each action magnified by the knowledge that any mistake could have irreversible consequences. And still, the main conflict loomed, unresolved. The plane was descending, the storm was approaching, and no engines meant they were still at the mercy of gravity, weather, and human coordination. The suspense was unrelenting. Every instruction from Rapta, every adjustment from the crew, every calculation from air traffic control served to delay the inevitable question that haunted every heart on board. Could Flight 872 survive the next crucial minutes? The boy's voice remained calm over the radio, steadying everyone, yet the uncertainty was palpable. Passengers whispered to each other, each man, woman, and child processing their fear in their own way. Outside, clouds churned, and the storm grew nearer, reminding everyone that nature is indifferent to human skill or bravery. Air traffic control held its breath as they monitored vectors, instruments, and the fragile glide path of the powerless aircraft. And in the cockpit, Lewis and Sarah followed every instruction with precision, trusting a child who had become, in this extraordinary moment, the unlikely center of authority. Every person on Flight 872 was acutely aware that survival was no longer a guarantee. Each passing second brought new variables, new threats, and new possibilities for disaster. And yet, amid the fear, awe, and tension, a strange, fragile hope lingered, born not from experience, not from authority, but from the courage, skill, and composure of a 12-year-old who called himself Raptor, and whose calm voice continued to guide them through the impossible. The storm outside closed in like a living wall. Flashes of lightning lit the sky, momentarily revealing the dark, rolling clouds that threatened to swallow Flight 872 whole. Thunder followed immediately, shaking the fuselage with a deep, resonant roar. Passengers felt their stomachs drop with every rumble, their hands clinging tightly to seats and loved ones. Even the most seasoned travelers were now reduced to whispers, prayers, and frozen expressions of fear. The plane's wings sliced through the turbulent air, flexing under the force of the wind, reminding everyone that they were in a fragile steel tube, suspended tens of thousands of feet above the ground with both engines dead. Captain Lewis's hands never left the yoke. His jaw was tight, sweat beating at his temple, but his eyes remained locked on the instruments. Raptor, adjust heading. Wind shear is increasing, he said, voice calm but sharp. The boy's response came immediately, precise, almost mechanical in its timing. Increase glide speed by 12 knots. Apply maintain altitude correction factor 3.5. Every command was followed without hesitation. And yet Lewis felt the weight of every single instruction pressing down on him. One small miscalculation could mean catastrophe. In the cabin, tension had reached a nearly unbearable level. Passengers were quiet now, the earlier murmurs of awe replaced by a gripping fear that seemed to occupy every corner. Mothers whispered comforting phrases to children who clutched tightly to stuffed animals or siblings, while others stared blankly at the ceiling, eyes wide, willing themselves not to look out the windows at the dark, violent storm. A teenage boy near the front of the cabin leaned over to his mother and whispered, "It's like the world is trying to push us down," and she squeezed his shoulder. Silent, afraid to speak. Emma, Raptor's sister, was next to him, eyes glued to her brother's focused face. She understood, more than anyone, the immense pressure he was under. He was no longer just her younger brother. He had become the center of the survival of Flight 872. Every adjustment he suggested, every calculation he made, was a thread holding hundreds of lives together. She whispered, barely audible, "You've got this, Raptor," though her own voice trembled. He didn't respond, but she didn't expect him to. His entire being was focused on the numbers, the glide, the vectors, the impossible puzzle of physics and human skill that he now commanded. Air traffic control was in a frenzy. Maria and her team had activated emergency protocols for every nearby airport capable of handling a powerless plane. Emergency crews were prepped, ambulances on standby, fire crews ready for impact. Yet, despite all their preparation, uncertainty gnawed at them. Flight 872's path was unpredictable. Wind conditions fluctuated violently with each gust, and the approach to the nearest airport was anything but clear. Every second was measured, every vector checked and rechecked, and still, there were no guarantees. The turbulence grew worse. The fuselage groaned, metal straining against the force of wind and gravity. Overhead bins rattled, and loose items bounced along the aisles, startling passengers. Flight attendants worked tirelessly, holding on to seats to maintain balance, reassuring passengers whose panic flared with every sudden jolt. Jessica, a veteran attendant, moved from row to row, her voice steady, though her own heart hammered in her chest. She caught sight of the boy in the middle of the plane, his calm composure a sharp contrast to the chaos around him, and she felt a flicker of hope, but even hope seemed fragile under the circumstances. Captain Lewis and Sarah were now coordinating minute by minute with Raptor and air traffic control. Each instruction required immediate action, precise banking, glide adjustments, speed corrections. The plane responded, but the turbulence made execution a razor-thin challenge. Lightning flashed again, this time closer, illuminating the anxious faces of passengers as shadows danced across the cabin. The roar of thunder followed, reverberating in every bone. It was as if the storm itself was testing their resolve, daring them to fail. Meanwhile, Raptor's mind raced faster than anyone could perceive. He calculated descent angles, potential landing sites, and variable wind speeds in fractions of a second. He considered the storm, the plane's glide factor, and the passenger's safety. Each calculation could be the difference between life and death. He remembered the countless hours in his simulator, replaying scenarios that now felt like life or death training. The knowledge he had acquired in the safety of his room had transformed into an extraordinary responsibility, and failure was no longer hypothetical. In the cabin, subtle human stories unfolded. A young couple held each other tightly, whispering confessions they had never voiced before. A businessman clutched his briefcase as if it were a lifeline, though he knew it was meaningless in the face of gravity. A mother quietly hummed to her infant, a tune that seemed impossibly fragile amid the violent storm outside. Each person experienced the crisis differently, yet all were united in the same gripping suspense, the uncertainty of Flight 872's fate. The storm intensified, rain beginning to pelt the fuselage at an angle that made visibility almost nil. Lightning danced closer, each flash revealing the tension etched on every face in the cockpit and cabin. Captain Lewis's hands moved instinctively, but his mind was constantly checking every instruction from the boy. Sarah monitored the instruments, her fingers hovering over controls in case sudden adjustments were required, and Raptor, seated calmly in the middle of the plane, gave commands that cut through the chaos with razor-sharp precision. Air traffic control was a whirlwind of activity. Maria barked instructions, coordinated landing vectors, and cross-referenced data from multiple radars. She knew that even the smallest miscommunication could have disastrous consequences. "Raptor, adjust heading to 3. Prepare for emergency approach vector," she said, her voice tight. The boy responded immediately, giving a series of corrections that reflected the perfect synthesis of instinct, knowledge, and focus. As the plane descended further, the main conflict became clearer. The engines were dead, the storm was unrelenting, and the landscape below offered limited options for landing. Mountains loomed, urban areas crowded, and every mile seemed Osar to the ground magnified the stakes. The passengers' fear was palpable, a shared tension that made the cabin feel heavier, denser, as if the air itself were thick with uncertainty. Captain Lewis caught his reflection in the cockpit glass for a brief moment. He saw a man grappling with the impossible, relying on a child's guidance, and yet he felt a strange surge of trust. The numbers aligned, the plane responded, and still the sheer magnitude of what they were attempting was nearly beyond comprehension. The tension was suffocating, a tightrope suspended high above the earth, and one misstep would mean disaster. Meanwhile, Emma watched her brother, sensing the enormous concentration and pressure on his young shoulders. She noticed the subtle lines of strain on his face, the tiny tremor in his hands despite his steady voice. "You're amazing," she whispered again, though the words barely left her lips. Raptor's focus didn't waver. He was aware of every fraction of a second, every angle of descent, every shift in wind and weight. The storm outside and the powerless engines inside made every decision critical, and he moved with an almost inhuman precision, balancing instinct, knowledge, and courage. In the cabin, passengers grew increasingly aware of the fragility of their situation. Every bounce, every shudder of the plane made hearts leap and stomachs twist. Conversations had ceased entirely, replaced by a tense, almost sacred silence. Flight attendants continued their work, quietly stabilizing passengers, offering water and reassurance, though inside, fear simmered just beneath the surface. Every person aboard was now part of the collective effort to survive, even if only as witnesses to the extraordinary actions of a child. Guiding them through impossible circumstances, the storm reached a new level of intensity. Winds gusted unpredictably, turbulence rattled the fuselage, and sheets of rain hammered against the windows. Captain Lewis had to make split-second decisions that would be unforgiving if executed incorrectly. "Raptor, we're going to need to adjust for wind shear in the next 30 seconds, he shouted over the roar of the storm. The boy's response was immediate and precise. Increase descent, glide to 300 knots. Apply counter-roll factor 4. Vector correction, immediate. Every second counted. Every command mattered. Air traffic controls, screens, were a blur of numbers, vectors, and trajectories. Maria's voice rang out in the comms, coordinating emergency teams, updating weather data, and monitoring the plane's path. She could feel the collective tension in the room, the weight of hundreds of lives balanced on a delicate thread. The boy's voice over the radio had become a lifeline, yet the storm, the engines, and the unforgiving descent kept the stakes impossibly high. The main conflict, the powerless plane, the approaching storm, and the uncertain landing was now intertwined with personal struggles and human resilience. Passengers confronted fear, trust, and mortality. Crew members navigated chaos while maintaining professional composure, and a 12-year-old boy, trained only in simulators, calculated minute-by-minute solutions that could determine life or death. Every person on board was connected, their fates intertwined in a suspenseful ballet of gravity, courage, and human ingenuity. The plane's descent brought it closer to terrain filled with obstacles, urban areas, rivers, and jagged hills. Visibility was near zero, lightning illuminating the darkness for only fractions of a second. Every adjustment required precision, timing, and perfect coordination between Captain Lewis, Sarah, Raptor, and air traffic control. One misstep, one delay, one misjudged gust could send the plane into an irreversible spiral. The suspense was unbearable, the tension almost tactile. Raptor's calm, precise voice continued to issue commands over the radio. Heading correction, 29, glide speed, 305 knots. Wind gust factor 4, brace for turbulence. His words were clear, deliberate, and steady, but inside, his mind raced with calculation after calculation. The storm outside and the powerless engines inside made every instruction critical. He was no longer just a boy. He was the fulcrum on which the survival of Flight 872 rested. Passengers and crew alike understood, deep down, that they were on the edge of something extraordinary. Every heartbeat echoed with suspense. The storm roared. The plane continued its impossible glide, and every eye, every ear, every mind aboard Flight 872 was fixed on the voice that had become their unlikely guide, hoping that each decision, each calculation, and each adjustment would be enough to see them through the storm and the final, deadly descent. The world outside raged on, indifferent to their plight, while inside, humanity revealed its finest and most fragile qualities. Courage, focus, and trust were being tested in every soul on board. And yet, even as the plane descended, the storm battered them, and the terrain loomed closer. One thought echoed through every mind. Flight 872 had survived this far against impossible odds, but the climax, the moment of ultimate danger, had not yet passed. The plane's glide path was already perilous, but the storm had more in store than anyone could anticipate. Lightning cracked closer than ever before, followed by an unnatural roar that shook the fuselage violently. Passengers screamed involuntarily, gripping seats and each other. The calm that had begun to form in pockets of the cabin evaporated instantly, replaced by a raw, primal fear. Captain Lewis tightened his grip on the yoke, muscles straining, while Sarah's eyes darted from instruments to exterior visibility. It was one thing to fly without engines under controlled circumstances. It was another to navigate a full-scale storm with turbulent gusts strong enough to tear at the wings. Then, something unexpected appeared on the radar, something no one had accounted for. A small but fast-moving aircraft was closing in from the rear, a private jet that had apparently entered the storm without clearance. Air traffic control scrambled to get a hold of it, their voices tense, urgent. Unknown aircraft approaching Flight 8, vector deviation imminent, Maria shouted. The private jet appeared on the screen as a bright dot, moving faster than any safe approach would allow. Its pilot seemed unaware of Flight 872, or perhaps unprepared for the chaos of the storm and the powerless plane in its path. Raptor's voice, calm yet commanding, cut through the comms. Captain Lewis, adjust heading immediately. 32 degrees starboard. Altitude correction plus 200 feet. Prepare for turbulence spike. The crew followed instantly. The plane lurched as it changed course, narrowly avoiding a collision that would have been catastrophic at this stage. The passengers, unaware of the near miss with another aircraft, felt only the sudden jolt, a terrifying reminder of how precarious their survival truly was. Emma clutched her brother's arm, eyes wide. "Raptor, what's happening now?" she whispered. Her voice trembled as she realized that not only were they fighting the storm, the powerless engines, and the ground below, they were now dealing with another, unpredictable factor in the sky. He didn't answer aloud, but his fingers flew over the tablet, calculating new vectors, anticipating the private jet's trajectory, and adjusting their glide path with impeccable precision. He was a 12-year-old acting as the linchpin between survival and disaster for hundreds of lives. Captain Lewis's mind raced. He had been trained for emergencies, but no protocol covered a powerless plane navigating a storm while simultaneously avoiding a fast-approaching aircraft. Every adjustment required instantaneous calculation. Every second mattered. The plane shuddered as it banked sharply to starboard, narrowly clearing the jet, its tail tip illuminated briefly by the storm's lightning. "Raptor," Lewis said, voice tight. "That was too close. How are you calculating these angles so perfectly?" The boy didn't answer directly. Instead, he gave more precise instructions, keeping everyone alive in the process. Back in the cabin, panic and awe coexisted. Passengers who had begun to whisper hopeful prayers now trembled visibly, realizing that the situation had escalated further. A mother gripped her child's arm so tightly she left bruises, and a businessman who had been recording video for evidence whispered, "This isn't real. It can't be real." Flight attendants moved through the aisles with quiet efficiency, offering reassurance even as their own hearts pounded. They had been trained to remain calm, but the unpredictability of the second airborne threat intensified the fear in ways that no tournée could fully prepare for. The storm wasn't finished. Heavy rain began to streak the windows, reducing visibility to near zero. Wind gusts shifted unpredictably, pushing the plane in ways that made every calculation a gamble. Raptor adjusted speed and heading continually, issuing commands that reflected a depth of understanding far beyond what anyone might expect from a child. Captain Lewis responded instantly, his hands moving reflexively on the yoke while his mind raced through multiple contingency plans. Air traffic control now faced an impossible challenge. They had to guide Flight 872, communicate with emergency crews, and track the rogue private jet simultaneously. Maria barked orders, relayed updated vectors, and coordinated with airport emergency personnel. Every second, every adjustment, became more critical. A minor miscommunication could lead to disaster not only for Flight 872, but potentially for the private jet as well. The room buzzed with intensity. Even veteran controllers felt the strain as the drama unfolded on multiple screens. Amid this, another twist emerged, one no one could have predicted. The instrument TS in the cockpit began flickering erratically. Gauges that had remained steady now displayed unusual readings, false altitudes, intermittent speed reports, and erratic glide ratios. Captain Lewis frowned, instinctively cross-checking with backup systems. "Sarah, we're losing reliable instrument data," he said. "We'll have to rely partially on visual cues and your calculations." The realization hit hard. They were navigating a storm, avoiding a fast-approaching plane, and dealing with failing instrument solve while engines remained dead. Raptor's voice remained unwavering. "Adjust glide for visual estimation. Bank angle 33 degrees. Correct for wind shear 5.2. Every word was precise, and every calculation, though made without complete instrument data, was spot. Captain Lewis followed, eyes flicking between the storm, the radar, and the boy's instructions. The plane responded, but the turbulence worsened, shaking the fuselage violently. The passengers felt the severity of this escalation. The overhead bins rattled, drinks spilled. A few individuals clutched their seats, bracing for impact. Whispers of fear grew louder. "We're not going to make it," muttered one man. A mother held her child close, repeating a silent prayer. Flight attendants continued moving efficiently, guiding passengers to maintain balance and composure, though the shaking made even the simplest tasks challenging. As Flight 872 descended, the terrain became a looming threat. Mountains rose sharply from the earth, forests stretched beneath the storm clouds, and urban clusters crowded potential emergency landing areas. The plane was powerless, the storm unrelenting, and the instruments failing. The margin for error had shrunk to mere feet. Every decision made by Captain Lewis, Sarah, and Raptor could be the difference between life and death. Raptor's sister, Emma, noticed a subtle change in her brother's demeanor. He was still focused, calm, precise, but there was a weight in his eyes that hadn't been there before. She understood instinctively. The stakes had risen beyond anything they had prepared for. He was processing variables faster than any adult could. But the unpredictability of the storm, the rogue plane, and failing instruments had pushed even him to the edge. She squeezed his hand, hoping silently that he could continue holding them all together. Captain Lewis made another sharp adjustment to avoid an unexpected wind shear. The fuselage shuddered violently, rattling everything inside the cabin. Lightning illuminated the cockpit, casting a stark contrast on their focused, tense faces. Lewis glanced at Sarah, then at the instruments, and then at Raptor, realizing that survival at this point depended not on experience or training alone, but on trust, coordination, and the improbable skills of a 12-year-old boy. Air traffic control scrambled to recalculate landing vectors, emergency crew positions, and storm dynamics. Maria's voice remained authoritative and calm, though the tension in her mind was intense. They were guiding a plane with no engines, failing instruments, in a storm, and now factoring in a near miss with another aircraft. Every second mattered. Every minor miscalculation could ripple into catastrophe. As Flight 872 dipped closer to the lower atmosphere, Raptor continued issuing commands with unmatched precision. Reduce glide angle by 3 degrees. Increase vector correction for brace for turbulence spike, he said. Captain Lewis executed instantly. The plane shifted and corrected, narrowly maintaining stability. The passengers, unaware of the technical brilliance guiding their survival, felt only the violent shudders of the storm and the silent, collective heartbeat of everyone on board. Then, in a moment that would make anyone's heart leap, a final complication appeared. One of the flaps on the plane's wing was malfunctioning, caught partially extended, threatening to destabilize the already fragile glide. Captain Lewis noted it immediately, his mind racing. The plane's ability to maintain balance was compromised. Raptor, we have a flap malfunction, he shouted. The boy's voice didn't waver. Corrective roll 22 degrees. Adjust glide 305 knots. Compensate with starboard rudder input 5%. Now, every adjustment had to be perfect. The storm, the failing instruments, the approaching terrain, and the rogue plane made this one of the most impossible maneuvers anyone could imagine. In the cabin, passengers felt the plane tip slightly more than before. Some gasped, others prayed silently. Flight attendants braced themselves as they guided passengers to maintain balance, offering reassurance even as the metal groaned around them. Every movement reminded them of the fragility of the situation, yet they clung to the one consistent anchor, the boy's calm voice over the comms, directing the impossible. Emma gripped her brother's arm tightly. Raptor, we can do this right, she whispered. His fingers never paused on the tablet, his voice steady, issuing precise commands. But inside he knew that any second could bring disaster. The storm, the failing instruments, the rogue aircraft, and now the malfunctioning flap hull combined to create an unprecedented, high-stakes challenge. Air traffic control's tension mirrored the cockpit's chaos. Every screen, every data point, every emergency team was coordinated for a crisis that seemed to escalate by the second. Maria's voice guided Flight 872, as if every word were a lifeline, her team monitoring all possibilities and recalculating contingency after contingency. And yet, even their collective experience could not fully account for the near-impossible combination of variables facing the powerless plane. The passengers, meanwhile, had begun to form silent alliances in their fear. Strangers held hands, children were comforted by neighbors. Even in terror, humanity revealed its resilience. Every shudder of the plane, every flash of lightning, every gust of wind heightened the suspense, drawing everyone deeper into the drama. The boy's calm/precise voice became a lifeline, the one constant in an ever-shifting storm of fear and uncertainty. Flight 872's descent continued, closer to mountains, forests, and urban obstacles. And yet no resolution had come. The main conflict, the powerless engines, the storm, the failing instruments, the rogue aircraft, and now the damaged flap remained unresolved. The stakes had risen higher than ever before. Every second, every adjustment, every human decision was critical. And yet, the most dangerous moments were still ahead. As Flight 872 approached the ultimate test of survival, the storm reached its fiercest point as Flight 872 approached the final stretch toward the emergency landing site. Lightning split the sky in blinding flashes, illuminating jagged terrain below. Rivers winding like dark veins, and distant city lights flickering through the sheets of rain. The plane shuddered violently with every gust, and passengers braced themselves instinctively, gripping seats, loved ones, and armrests as though sheer will could keep the metal bird in the air. The hum of the storm drowned out everything else. But amid the chaos, the calm, unwavering voice of Raptor cut through, guiding Captain Lewis and Sarah through the impossible. Heading correction 2 knots, glide speed 305 knots, flap compensation at 50%, the boy instructed, fingers moving over the tablet with machine-like precision. Captain Lewis responded immediately, banking the plane to compensate for the malfunctioning flap and adjusting for wind shear as the storm roared. His voice over the intercom remained calm but taut with tension. All passengers, brace for final approach. Stay seated and hold on. The plane dipped lower, the ground rushing up beneath them faster than any simulation could have prepared them for. Visibility was nearly zero, the rain so heavy it streaked across windows like sheets of glass, distorting every light outside. Lightning illuminated jagged mountain ridges just moments before the aircraft passed dangerously close. The passengers gasped and whispered prayers, holding tightly to each other. some shaking uncontrollably, others frozen in awe. The storm had reached its peak, yet every adjustment Raptor instructed brought Flight 872 closer to survival. Emma leaned over her brother, eyes wide and voice trembling. "You're really doing it, Raptor. We're going to make it, right." He didn't speak, but his fingers flew over the tablet, giving final, precise adjustments. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he calculated trajectories in fractions of a second. He was no longer a boy playing in a simulator. He was the lifeline for hundreds of souls, a calm force threading through the chaos of wind, rain, failing instruments, and a crippled plane. Captain Lewis's hands were locked on the yoke. Every instinct he had acquired over decades screamed at him to act, but every calculation from the boy told him something else. Trusting Raptor was the only chance they had. "Hold steady," he murmured under his breath, voice almost lost to the storm. Just a few more minutes. Outside, the rogue private jet that had earlier threatened a collision had altered course, disappearing into the storm behind them. Air traffic control relayed emergency updates, but the main focus now was the terrain below. The plane was low, the ground approaching fast, and there was no margin for error. Every second, the storm's force tried to push them off course. Testing the limits of physics and human endurance, the passengers held their breath as the plane's landing gear lowered. Flaps extended as fully as the malfunction allowed, and the glide angle corrected for turbulence and wind shear. Flight attendants shouted instructions, securing everyone, their faces pale but resolute. Every heartbeat on board felt magnified. Every small sound creaks of